Let's get class kicked off tonight. We are going to be working on our chat application for most of the evening, but I do want to open it up for any questions you guys might have, whether it's anything capstone related, whether it is anything that we did from the blog application from last night, any questions in general that we have before we dive into the second part of the chat application. Be really mean of me right now if I did attendance for the people who were like a couple minutes late. Just kidding, I'm not going to do that. All right, let's go ahead and dive in then to where we left off on the chat app, because honestly, I don't really remember, but we got to start with the code anyway. So I am heading into my code, my week 15, nope, my week 14. I'm going into my day 3 chat. I'm going to delete out my node modules. Then I'm going to take my day 3 chat in my week 14 folder. Make sure you've got your file management going on right here. So in week 14, day 3 chat, I deleted out node modules. I'm going to go up to my week 14, click on my day 3 chat and Command C to copy that. Then I'm going to head down into my week 15 and go ahead and paste that in. And then before we forget, I'm going to rename my day 3 to my day 4 chat so that we are keeping naming conventions all up to date. Once I've got my day 4 chat there, I'm going to throw that into VS Code. I am going to right-click open in integrated terminal. I'm going to npm install to get my node modules back and give that a second to cook. Okay, now that I've got all of that in, I'm going to do my npm run start. And that should fire us back up to the user interface that we left off with. Also share the live share link with you. This is where Zoom likes to play Where's Waldo, sometimes with where the screen sharing bar goes, and I can never find things. Okay, I do have you guys out on my second monitor over here. So if you have anything in the chat, feel free or raising your hand, just let me know audibly because I may not see it. Okay, so where did we leave off? We had our header set up. We've got our messages set up. We have separated out our outgoing and incoming messages. So all of that is good. But if I remember correctly, we can type something in down here, but when we hit the send button, nothing happens. And so now I'm like, okay, I need some way to get this message to show up as a message up here. But I also want to make sure that my messages are based off of state. And so if I go into my messages list, I see I do have my messages to list. That is coming through a prop in my messages list. So let's give ourselves a little refresher. Where is messages list coming from? Well, if I look in my app.js, because this is not a multi-page application, I can see I've got my messages in state, which are getting passed into my messages to list, which is getting passed into my messages list, which is coming in as my prop that we then map over. So remember, a map is just a special type of for loop, right? All it's doing is looping over each item in my messages to list prop that is eventually coming from my state all the way up here, again, through the prop. But by mapping over it, I get each individual message. Okay, well, what do I want to do from each individual message? I want to figure out, is it an outgoing message? And if it is, show this outgoing. Otherwise, it's got to be an incoming message. So go get access to that. So again, we are kind of going down the list here. We go from messages in state, which is this entire array to get started, down to messages in state, which goes to messages to list, which goes into the messages list component, which gets the messages to list prop, which we then map over to get each individual message, which we then take that individual message and send into either the outgoing or incoming message, which means that in the incoming message, we are able to access things like .text, which make its way all the way up the chain to the text that we are seeing here. So give yourself just 2 minutes here, trace through it on your files or on my live share. Kind of go through and make sure that you understand, hey, either can I comment this out and understand the flow of all of this data? Because believe it or not, we're about to make that flow even a little bit more complicated. So either visually or in comments, can you understand that flow? Can you say, hey, I understand messages in state is linked to the messages in state here? Can I understand that the messages to list here lines up with the messages to list here? Take a minute, make sure you understand the flow, and if you have any questions, ask them now. Give you just a minute or two to review this.
I got a question.
Yeah.
I don't know where it was, where you were mapping over the messages.
Messages list.
So the individual message that acts similarly as like something like item in for item of items.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah, so this is the list, the array that we're mapping over, and then this is getting us each individual item in that array.
Gotcha.
Very good question. Any other questions? Give you guys another minute or two to review.
And I guess I can ask exactly how map is working and what the difference is, or if it's just like a for of slash for each for React.
It is not React specific, so can use .map in vanilla JavaScript. The difference between I guess map is technically closer to for each. The difference is map returns out items. And so whatever is returned from the map comes out as an array. So let's do a little example on this because I think .map is one of those things that you don't really understand until you see it. So let's say that we've got an array of even numbers, right? And we'll say 2, 4, 6. And we would like an array of odd numbers. Well, how would we do that? If we wanted to convert each one of these to an odd number, we could go over our even numbers and map them to get access to each even num. Then we could return the even num plus 1.
Right.
Then if we console log out our odd nums, oh, by the way, don't follow me on this. This is just an example. And take a look in our console, we can see we get an array with 3, 5, and 7 in it. So what are we trying to do there? Well, we could do this with a for loop for sure, right? But the end goal of this is to get an array out. And so map is a specific type of loop that you are basically saying loop over this original array or map this original array to this other different kind of array. So what are we trying to do? Why are we trying to do that? Well, because our messages to list is just an object. But what we're trying to do is map each object to a component in React, right? So if I ask you, hey, here's your input, map this input to the output, you would be able to say, oh, well, this thing looks like this thing, so I'm mapping these two items together, right? That's what we're doing in our JavaScript. We are saying, hey, this is the input, and I would like to map this individual input in that array to some new thing. In this case, we are saying generate out a new array of components based off of the input of each individual message. So take a list of messages that happens to be an object, and for each object that you find in that array, return out a component that shows the content that I'm looking for.
So you can get the same functionality with like a for of for each. It's just this is more concise and easier to read.
Yeah, it's more concise because React and JSX, I guess more JSX than React, is set up to render arrays, right? And so what we would have to do if we didn't use the map is we would have to do something like this. Let message components equal an array. Components. No, I definitely spelled that wrong. Gonna wait for someone to tell me I spelled it wrong though. Component. All right. Then I could say for let, you know what, we have to do this inside the component so I get access to the array. For let each individual message of messages to list. And then for each one of them, I would do this if statement. Again, don't follow me on this, just as an example. And then instead of returning it, I need to push it. So I'm going to have to say message components dot push that in. And then finally, instead of doing it all down here in an inline statement, I could come in here and say message components, and this does the exact same thing without the key, but whatever. We'll fix that in a second. So what is this doing, right? This is logic to basically say, hey, loop over all of the messages, then based off of the type of the message, push that message in to our array of all of the components, then make those components show up here. So this accomplishes the exact same thing. Why don't we use this in React? Or why does React prefer to do a .map? Well, because we are doing some logic around rendering the component, that is preferred to be done in the return, not up here. So if you had to do something really complex with mapping and you had 19 different components that were showing up and the logic got really complicated, or maybe you had to do some math to figure out what components would be showing, this approach would actually be preferred. But because we are doing a very basic, hey, based off of this data, loop over all the data and return out these components, that's when the map is preferred. So I'm actually going to comment all of this out and this out, and then I'm going to put it back to the way it was, just so you can see the alternative. So below is an alternative to map, but it's not preferred in React code. And then I'm going to just take all of this and do my messages to list map to get each individual message out. And then I'm going to put these back in and change these back to my return. And if I did all of that right, we should be back up to working. So let me leave that on the screen because that example may help you guys. These two are doing the exact same thing. The only problem is that we can't use this for loop in line down here in our return. So what we have to do is basically generate it all before the return, and then we could use it in the return down here. So this is the preferred React style, but I do think it's important to say, hey, if I'm not understanding what the map is doing, let me see if I can understand it using this for loop approach. Now that you can see it in the for loop approach, If you're like, I still don't get it, now's the time you got to go, all right, I got to ask questions about that, right? Even if the question is, I still don't get it, I don't, try and explain it another way, right? That's a totally fine question. Sometimes the frustrating part about learning is that you know that you're not getting it, but you don't know what question to ask. That's okay. We can work together on that if you are feeling that spot. But this is a really good example and why I take time at the beginning of class to say, hey, you may not understand this, but you do understand this. And you can use this approach as a stepping stone to understanding how this works down here. Or you could look at both of them and go, I'm not getting either of those approaches. I need to ask more questions.
I do have a follow up. Is there or I guess what topic would I read into for why React prefers dot map over the other logic?
Very good question. And I was going to pull up. I'm hoping, thinking in React, blah, 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 building a static version, UI state, where your state should live, which we are going to talk about today when we send that message, inverse data flow, where to go from here. Boo. All right, let's see. So it's interesting because the documentation does show map up here, but it does the map outside of the return. Um, Key, rules of key, where does React need keys? Well, I thought I was going to find something quicker than I could. React, let's try one last attempt. React docs map. Yeah, this was the page we were already on. And this is the older React documentation, which I think that this is actually better than their newer documentation. And this gets into keys, which I think we've talked a little bit about. Embedding map in JSX. And then this basically shows us, hey, we can either map over everything and then return that out, or we could do that map directly inline, which is exactly what we did down here. So the real answer to all of this is just that React happens to display a list of components very well if that list of components is already in an array. And map is very specifically meant to map an existing array to a new array compared to a for loop, which is more generic, right? So it would be like the difference between using a div tag for a header or using the semantic HTML header tag. Well, they both accomplish the exact same thing. They're both going to show to the typical end user the same way. What they aren't going to do is help out with screen readers and boost your SEO because you're not using that header tag. The same goes here, right? At the end of the day, you're just generating out an array, but we can't do this for loop as an inline statement because it's multiple lines, right? We got to set up the array, then we got to do the loop. In this situation, this is technically all one expression to React, right? This is all one line of code because it's in between one set of curly braces. So you couldn't accomplish this same thing in line as part of your return, but you can with the map.
Yeah,
And
I just tried to get ChatGPT's answer on it. The basic 4 points is improved readability, easier maintenance, enhanced declarative nature, and avoiding unnecessary computations.
yeah,
Essentially, the its overarching theme was like trying to keep the uh dot map inside the return to keep it closer to keep it more closely tied to the JSX.
yes, yes, that is what I was trying to say and probably did not articulate well. But yes, I agree with ChatGPT's answer there. Okay, why are we spending time on this, right? Because this is a very common theme to see in our code. Hey, we've got some data structure. It's usually an array. That array is either going to have the data directly in it, or it's going to have objects in it that contain that data. Why do we need to map over it? Well, because React can't show an object, and we wouldn't want to show an object to the end user. So instead, we map that object, that data structure that is all contained in the array, we loop over each item inside of it and map whatever that data is to a component that we render. These are these are two different ways of doing it. I am sure there are more than two, but I want to pause here. Does anyone have any questions about mapping in general? Okay, so here's where we net it out. We've got messages to list coming from our app.js. That's up here. But we are down in our message input down here, and we've got the message that they typed in. And we know that we can see that message because we've got it tied to the onSubmit. So if I go in here and type in a message, ABC, ignore this warning, we'll fix that before the end of class, and I hit the send button, I have ABC in here. How can I get the ABC or the inputted message here to reflect in my state up here? Not a rhetorical question. And the hint is we have already solved for this problem in a different component. How do we get access to information in the parent when we are down in the child? How do we get access to this use state here when we are in the message input down here and have the information here? How do we pass information from the parent to the child? How did we make in messages list every outgoing and incoming message not look exactly like each other? How did we get the information from the individual message into outgoing message so each outgoing message would show its unique text? Props, exactly. So props we can use not only to send around the data, we can actually use props to send around the functions as well. So I'm going to go down into message input, and I'm going to keep along with this theme of the prop name and the value name not being the same. So I'm going to say update messages is equal to set messages. Now you can start following along with me finally, if you are coding along with this project. So we have update messages now coming into message input. We need to tell message input that that's coming in. So I'm going to go into message input and I'm going to tell it, hey, you are going to get something called update messages. The problem that we're going to run into, though, is if we try to update the messages, we are going to overwrite all of the messages that are already in there. So we also, in our app.js, have to update that to also pass in existing messages, which is going to equal our messages in state. So we are taking the two props messages in state and sending that in here, and the set messages here, and we're sending that into update messages here and existing messages here. These props need to line up with the props in our message input. So update messages is one, existing messages is the other. Then in my send message, I am going to say, hey, I'm going to update my messages, and I'm going to make my updated messages equal to whatever the existing messages are. So take whatever the existing messages are and spread them out into this new array. But I'm also going to put another object in there. I'm going to put something that looks like an existing message we already have. So I'm going to copy this entire object and paste it into here. The timestamp is going to be a new date. That's fine. But this is a message that I'm typing in. This is a message that I am sending out. It's an outgoing message. So I'm going to change that to true. And then I want to take whatever text got typed into this input. Well, what text got typed into the input? Whatever was set into inputted message. Inputted message, we have access to right here. So I'm going to take my inputted message and paste it into my text. Go ahead and save that. I'll pop in my Google Chrome. I will hit the send button on my ABC, and my ABC message shows up. And because we made this a controlled input by tying the value and the on change into state, right? Why do we say control? Because React is controlling it. After we update the message, we can actually set the inputted message to an empty string. And don't worry, after this step, I am going to pause and review this entire flow. So we set inputted message here. Now, when we send a new message and hit the send button, a new message appears and clears out the input down here. So I'm going to pause here. This is very tricky, right? Because there's a lot of places that we can get lost. So you need to make sure up at the app level in the message input, we're passing in both two props and two values. Then in our message input, we need to tell it, hey, you're going to get two props. Then when we send the message, we need to update the messages by copying whatever the existing messages are and adding the new one in, using the inputted message, which is coming from state. And then finally, we want to clear out our input. So after they send the message, the text input clears out. And if all of that is working, when you go over, you should be able to send a message and hit the enter button and have a message appear. Before we do a review of this and number out all of this code, does anyone have questions or not have their code working? Terry.
Yeah, I'm still not getting the whole props thing. Like, I'm not really understanding how, like, well, why do we need to like use props or like, you know?
Okay, so let me I'm going to try to oversimplify it and see if that gets a light bulb moment. We've got a variable here called messages in state. I want to be able to use messages in state in my message input file. I wanted to get access to this messages in state and came in here and said console.log messages in state, I get an error right away. Messages in state is not defined. What do you mean it's not defined? Well, it's defined in app. But just because it's defined in app doesn't mean that I get access to it in message input. So I need to send the information in my app level, my messages in state, down into my message input. And so the way that I do that is with props. I take the value that I want to send in, messages in state, and put it in a prop value. Then I name that prop, and that prop traditionally is named the same thing, but it doesn't have to be. So think about props as basically the parameters for a component. When we need to send information into a function so the function knows how to behave, we use a parameter. In React, instead of using parameters, because these aren't functions at this point, right? This looks like HTML to me. Well, what we do instead is we send in a prop, and then we access that prop here as the first parameter of the function that is making the component. So all props are a way to access data from the parent component down in the child. Oh, I hijacked localhost, sorry. I can fix it. It's so weird how that doesn't do it all the time. Okay, you should have your localhost 3000 back. Just refresh. Did that help, Terry? Yeah, and you know what? Let me just, because sometimes I think I'm a genius, and then you read the way React puts it, and you're like, oh, that's a much better way to understand it, right? So if we um props are a way of passing data from parent to child. If you're familiar with the concept of state, don't use state to build this. State is interactivity since it's a static version. Okay, yeah. So one sentence, right? Props are a way of passing data from the parent to the child. We've got data up here in app. We want to get access to that data down in the message input. So we take that data and we send it in. And whatever we send it in on here is the name of the prop. And the name of the prop has to line up with the props when we get down into the child. All right, any other questions? Okay, let's number. Oh, go ahead.
So just think of as like parameters. Oh, I was just saying, so think of like props as like parameters. Like just think of them as um like like you know how you have like a function and two parameters. So just think of props like that.
Yeah. Yep. You're breaking up there a little bit, but yes, the general idea there is parameters are to functions as props are to components. And the reason we need to do that is the same reason we need parameters in functions, right? Functions may behave differently based off of what data we're sending into them. The same goes for the components, right? We want each of these outgoing messages to look kind of the same, but the content of them changes based off of what data we're sending into them. So what do we send in the messages list? We send in the message. Well, in that outgoing message, we get access to the props and use the text inside of them. We just happen to be using two different ways of accessing the props. Here, we call it message to single. message to single lines up with message to single here. So whatever data is in the individual message is what is going to show up in the text here. Okay, let's do a review of all of this. So we start up in our app.js. We import functions, import components, so we can use them on this page in the return JSX. So we got to import these files here so they know what paths they're coming from, so that when we use them down here, it knows this header lines up with this header up here. Number 2, set up state of some initial messages that uses an array of objects to represent each message that was sent or received. Now we've got the text, the timestamp, and whether or not it's outgoing on both of those. Now we come down here and we say number 3, return out our user interface for the first time. Come down here, the header. We show this header, that shows up here. Pretty self-explanatory, not going to number that out. What we do, however, want to number out is number 4. Show the messages list component and pass in the state as a prop called messages to list. So now we jump over here into number 5. Receive the state from the parent component, which happened to be called app.js, through a prop called messages to list. So now whatever is in messages to list is basically this messages in state, which by default starts out as this array. So if I go into messages to list and console log out my messages to list, when I first load the page, it is our 2 objects. So whatever is in here goes into messages in state. Messages in state gets sent into messages to list. Messages to list, console logs out here. Pausing there, even though we're only 5 steps in, that is somewhat of a complicated flow. So does anyone have questions about that flow? Okay, so now we come down here and we say number 6, loop over each message in the prop to get access to individual message. Then check to see if the individual message is outgoing. If it is, return a outgoing message component that has the individual message sent in as a prop. So now, before we can go on, we go into outgoing message and we say number 9, render the text from the message to single prop sent in from number 8. So we're using this message to single prop to get access to the individual message, which is coming from our map. Our map is coming from the prop. The prop is coming from up here. Up here is coming from here. Here is coming from messages in state. Messages in state is coming from our state. Our state starts out as this array. Go all the way back down to our outgoing message level. It says render the text from the message to single prop sent in number 8, which is right here. And then say number 9, if it isn't an outgoing message, instead show the incoming message component. Before someone gives me crap, that's number 10. Okay, now we go into incoming message, and we do the same thing here. We say number 11, show the text of the message to single prop. Okay, now it's continues looping over this over and over and over again until it has shown all of the messages. Then we go back into app.js and say number 12, after we are done looping over the existing messages, show the input. To send a new message. Give this component access to both the state value and the function to update the messages, both via props. Yes, you can think about props as another way of basically passing scope or getting access to a scope that is in another component, right? So this is somewhat unique to React, but not necessarily unique to front-end libraries or frameworks, right? So state is the component's memory. Props are the parameters, so we can either get access to other variables or change how those variables impact the component itself. Okay, so here we, excuse me, are done looping over the existing messages. We got to show the message input. So we go into the message input. We say number 13, set up state to controlled input to we skip the send message because send message is a function. This doesn't get triggered until the event happens. Now we come down here and we'll say 14, link form submission to send message function. We come down here and we say number 15, link this input value and on change to our state from number 13, which makes this a controlled input. Okay, now we come down into, they are going to type whatever in. The user then hits the send message button. We now come up to 15 and say message user has triggered the form submit event. We prevent it from defaulting. Then we have to number 16, update state. Coming in from props from app.js. So this update messages is lining up with our update messages, which is lining up with set messages, which is lining up with set messages up here. So we're going to say, which is update state coming in from props from app.js number 2, all the way down here. And what are we doing when we update messages? We're saying number 17, thread a copy of all the existing messages into this new array. So take all of these existing messages here and copy them into here. Then 18, make a new message, the one we're sending, with outgoing to true, the timestamp to the current time, and finally, the inputted message from state on number 13. So this inputted message is coming from inputted message here. Inputted message here is getting updated from set inputted message. Set inputted message is getting updated whenever this input changes. So I'm going to say from 13 and 15. Now, this triggers some other stuff. But before I forget, I'm going to say 19, clear the inputted message text input. Okay, so now what happens? We're not done here. We have now updated messages. Updated messages goes now to app.js and goes, hey, these messages have changed. So now we have to go to messages list and say 19, because messages list has changed from number 18. Remember, number 18 from, I should say 16. I'll say 16 through 18. Because messages in state is updated, the messages list has changed, and this prop now receives a new value. So we have to go into messages list. Messages list gets the new prop here, comes all the way down here and says 20. A new message has been added to this list. So map over the messages again and make the new message now show. Come down here, 21. The new message is an outgoing message. 22, send the new message into outgoing message. Component. And then finally, in outgoing message, we finally, 23, show the new message text. And we have finally completed the MVP, the minimal viable product of our chat application. So we are going to make the timestamp show up. We're going to take a look at making an edit button work as well, and go from there. But I want you guys to take at least 3 minutes. So take until 6:26, read through the number of these code, make sure that you can make sure that you can understand those comments and follow the numbering. And if you don't understand one of the comments, ask me about it. Oh, I've got two 15s. Shit. Okay, well, I'm going to find one of the 15s and call it 15A and the other one 15B because I don't want to renumber all of them. 15. Uh, 15 and 15. Okay, so this is 15B and this is 15A. Sorry about that. And Joe, I will answer your question after everyone has a chance to review. It's a good one. All right, where are we at? Do we want another minute to review? Do we have any questions?
I need another minute.
You got it. All right. Anyone else need another minute? Okay. So Joe asked the question, at what point is it considered to make something its own component? Is it best practice to make each smallest piece of content its own component, group by where it's pulling in information, example, a map or a for loop? Do different approaches have different consequences outside of readability and maintenance? Yes, 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 and yes. Oh, and it depends. So it's very common to start making a component and then realize that your component has turned into a massive section of code that you want to break up. But then you go to start breaking it up and you start realizing, oh, I had access to state here. If I make this its own component, I'm not going to have access to the state and I'm going to have to pass in that state as props. So refactoring becomes a little bit more challenging because what you have access to in the parent component, you may lose access to down in the child component, right? But you also don't want to go to an extreme on that. you could theoretically call something like outgoing message container, and then you could have another component called outgoing message text. And you get to this level where it's so granular that you're like, all right, these are just 2 or 3 line components. I don't want to break it down and get too extreme, right? So there definitely is a balancing point there. But I have heard in general people say that you should really be shooting for having every component to be somewhere as extreme as no more than 50 lines, or all the way up to about 250 lines. So anything that is repeating, for example, an outgoing or incoming message, hands down, make it a component right out of the gate, right? Anything that you're mapping over, hands down, make it a separate component. For something where you're you're going, oh, there's a lot of different functions here, there are a lot of different events here. If there is a logical place to break them up, then you should be making it its own component, right? Up at the top level, it kind of makes sense we put header in as its own thing. Header doesn't have any props, it's not accessing any state. It's actually really simple, right? But why don't we just throw that in app.js? It would work exactly the same, but it separates out our code and makes it a lot cleaner, right? To say, hey, header's over on its own. And down the road, if header changes, if we do have to support conversations with multiple people, if we do need to add in a new message button or a go back to see the entire list button, we're setting us up for success by separating out the code. So there's no hard and fast rule. There's no other than a repeating component. Other than that, there isn't a strict line where you go, hey, I need to make this its own component, but you do want to think about passing the state around, and also not getting too complex with, oh, I need this access to the state, but I'm 6 components down, so now I need to pass that down prop after prop after prop. The solution to that in modern React code is something called the context API. And the context API basically allows you to access state that's up in the parent, no matter how many levels down you are, without having to pass that prop every single time, down through however many levels you have to go. That gets a little bit out of the scope of what we teach about in React. But is now becoming kind of more intermediate React of, can I access props without having to pass them down through a very long line? So of course, the answer to everything in programming is, well, it just depends. But hopefully that gives you a little bit more context, pun intended, on when you make them separate components.
Yeah, I was kind of coming at it from like, I know passing props between like 700 different components would look atrocious, but I didn't know if it had an impact on how the browser is managing the memory, or how fast it's able to render, if it's impacting performance in any way.
As long as you are being judicious with your keys, which is something we're going to go fix next, it won't matter, but it does make for really unreadable code. When you're trying to figure out, like, where's that stupid use state? I'm going through 9 different prop levels to find that initial value. That's when you get into using the context API. But because we are only talking about 3 levels deep, well, 3 levels deep, right? We've got our app, we've got our messages list, and we've got our incoming and outgoing messages. That's all we really want to start with. So in this case, it's not a problem, but the context API is certainly the solution to that. Not necessarily for performance, but for making the code much more readable and understandable. Okay, let's fix an error, and then I'm going to show you guys the dev tools, and I think that should take us to the break. Maybe we'll throw a timestamp in. And then when we come back from break, we'll add in an edit button and get a little bit more practice with that. Okay, so big red text, never a friend of a developer. It says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. And React does go into this both in their newer documentation and their older documentation about why keys are important. So it says keys help React identify which items have changed, are added, or removed. Keys should be given to elements inside the array to give elements a stable identity. Okay, what does a stable identity mean? It means that at some point, if we edit or delete this message without a key, React is going to have a hard time knowing what messages are related to each other, right? So if we change this text down the road and say, instead of hello world, we say hello mom first message, React doesn't want to have to go through the entire array to see what items have changed. It wants to be able to go, oh, I'm keeping track of all of these items using a key. So when that particular key gets updated, I don't need to go through and re-render everything, which is what we would have to do in vanilla React or vanilla JavaScript. So what we do is we need to keep track of each one of these outgoing and incoming messages. Because the timestamp of those messages is never going to change, that's what we're going to use as our key. However, because we don't have a database ID, we could also use an index. Either one should get the job done. So I'm going to do key equals my individual message dot timestamp. And I'm going to do that on both of these components. So whenever we are mapping over, right, whenever we are generating out new components based off of an array, every item that comes out of that array, out of that map, should have a key prop on them. So if I come over here and refresh, timestamp is not a good idea. And that's exactly why I did that, because it now says encounter 2 children with the same key. Well, what do we mean by that? When we generate out our messages for the first time, we make both of them equal to the current time. So we can't use timestamp as a key because these keys are exactly the same. So now React can't keep track of which one is the unique one that we're trying to update. So instead, we are going to use the index simply because we have no better option. Normally, the database would be generating our IDs out for us. Those IDs would be unique, and that's what we would use as keys. But because we don't have a unique key to use here, we are going to get access to the index. This is the second parameter of the dot map. We get access to the index because of map. And so I'm going to use the index in here instead of the timestamp. Because again, keys do have to be unique. So now if I save that, I come over, I refresh, we should see our console is now cleared out. Okay. Anyone need another minute? Anyone not have their console cleared? You need an index up here, and then we add the index in as a prop called key on both our incoming and outgoing message. All right. The other thing I want to show you guys is if we take a look at our elements, this can be really helpful. We've seen the dev tools before. There's nothing new going on there. And we can start to see kind of how this comes out. Hey, this messages list lines up with my messages list right here. And when I'm mapping over all of this stuff, an outgoing message comes out, and that outgoing message has the call 2 and the call 10. All of that line up with the call 2 and the call 10 here. So all of that is good to go, and we can kind of understand that. But wouldn't it be nice if we could actually see what React is seeing? If we could actually see, hey, what's going into these props here? Where is my outgoing message component showing? Well, there are dev tools specific to React that allow us to see those components, the props and the state. All of that's kind of cool. So what we're going to do is if you go to this specific URL, which I will post in the chat, this is specifically for Chrome. So I do not know if Safari or Firefox have these tools. I'm sure they do. But in Chrome, if you go specifically to that URL, you should be able to go up to the top search here and type in React Developer Tools and hit enter. Oh, nope, sorry, I lied. Over on the left, it says discover more extensions and themes on the Chrome Web Store. Go ahead and click on that link. That brings you to here, and here you can do a search for React Developer Tools, and it will take you to this page. And then you should have an install button up here at the top. I will remove mine or add to Chrome. So if you're in Chrome, go ahead and hit add to Chrome there. It says it can read and change data on all websites. Don't panic too much about that. Just part of the DevTools being able to see that you are on a React website. Go ahead and hit add extension on that. Say React DevTools has been added to Chrome. Now, if we go back to our chat app, you may have to refresh the page. So when you refresh the page, you pop open inspect. Up here up at the top, you should see the React logo and components and profiler. Profiler is for React performance. That gets a little bit out of the scope, but do you guys see components after you've added the extension? Does anyone not see components showing up in their DevTools? So you should be able to click on components and see this. Now this is helpful because if we click on our app and give it a second to load, a little bit longer than I would hope it would take, refresh.
I was having some mouse issues. Would you be able to do that one more time?
Yeah, if you just right click and pop open, did you get this installed?
No, I will go do that.
Okay. Yeah, the link is in the chat, and Terry, thank you for putting in the Firefox one. And then after you refresh the page and go to DevTools, you can go to components. It's probably already in your top bar. And if you click on app over here on the left, we can start seeing some information, which is kind of cool. We can look into the state and see our two messages as objects showing up. And if we send a new message, we can see if we are still on the app, we can see everything that is in our state. And this can be really helpful for debugging, right? Of seeing that new information showing up. We can also go into our messages list and see the props getting sent in messages to list lines up with our app messages to list. And we can even see the value of those props because those are coming in from our app state. And if we go into something like outgoing message, we can again see the props that are getting sent in, and the entire stack trace of outgoing message is rendered by messages list. Messages list is rendered by app. So this is a new level of developer tools, letting us get in and be able to kind of see these components as we are working on them. And there's some additional things over here for debugging. You can inspect the matching DOM element, and that will take you right over to the regular elements tab, so we can see how that's showing up. There's something called suspend that will basically allow you to do some loading information with it. But these can be really, really helpful for seeing the components as we're working on them and all of that kind of fun stuff. So doesn't probably seem very helpful now, but as you start building more advanced apps that have more nested components, you're trying to debug, you're trying to figure out why something isn't showing up, or you're passing a prop down through several levels, this can be helpful to make sure that the data is making it all the way down to the level that you expect. Okay, let's do one more thing before the break. Let's get our timestamps showing up. We can see the timestamp is in each one of our messages, but we're not actually showing that in the user interface. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to head over to VS Code. I'm going to work in my outgoing message first, and I have my props message to single here. If I look in my props in my outgoing message, I can see my message to single has the timestamp. So I should theoretically be able to say, hey, outside of my message text span, I'm going to access my props. I'm going to access my message to single, and I'm going to throw my timestamp in. I save that, I come over here, and now I've got a very ugly error that if I refresh does not go away. I just get a white screen instead. But in my console, I can see it says objects are not valid as React child. Found object date. Well, what's the problem there? The problem is this date is a special object. It is basically trying to tell React is trying to tell us objects and arrays are too complex for us to show up. What we understand how to show are HTML elements and text. And when you give us this date, it's got the time zone in it. It's got all of this information. We need a string to show instead. And so we can accomplish that. I'm going to only show the locale time string. But if you wanted to, you could use date in there or to locale string period, and it would give you all the information. So if I save that, it now shows up, but it doesn't really show up where I want it to. And if I refresh this, that error will go away. Well, we can fix that with a little CSS. Let's throw that in a div. Our div should move it down onto the next line. It does. So now we can come in and add some style to that. Let's add a color of gray and maybe a font size of 10. Not too bad. Maybe let's go up one step and add some margin to the top of it of 5 pixels. Okay, liking the look of that a little bit better. And if I send a new message, we will see that it has the updated time showing on it. And this is where React starts to get more fun, right? Is we've done a lot of work in here to make sure all of this data gets passed down to that level. But once we do have it down to that level, it's a little bit more interactive, right? It's a little bit easier to just throw those divs in, throw all of that information in, because we've done the work to set up the reusable components. Now, what we are missing is the timestamp for any incoming message. So I'm going to take that div, I'm going to borrow that, I'm going to go over to my incoming message, and I'm going to throw that under the span as well. And now we have to be careful. In the incoming message, we aren't accessing the props with something called props up here. We get access to the message to single directly. So all we need to do is take out our props period. And just like that, we have our timestamp also showing up on our incoming messages as well. So just a reminder on this, we can access props in really 3 different ways, but we're showing 2 here. We can either access the prop by the prop name directly if it's in curly braces, or we can get access to props by not putting it in curly braces, then saying props and whatever the name of the prop is. So 2 different ways of accessing props. I see both of them being used. Pros and cons to both of them. So whatever you are seeing is totally fine. Okay. I'm going to let you guys catch up on that. I'm going to get a quick poll up to figure out where we are headed after the break. And then we will go on break. Okay, so a couple options. We can either get edit and delete working in our chat application after the break. We can say, all right, I've learned enough from the chat that everything that I can. So I'm going to do new React project from scratch. We're going to get practice with using an API that we've never used before. We're going to get all of that integrated into React. Or you guys may have some other idea in the chat application and we can go into that. Ooh, it's a close one. All right. Last chance to vote. Going once, going twice. Got some nerd fans up in the house. And go over to Star Wars. Just so we're close to 7 and we don't go on break too early, let's get our new project set up and then we will go on break. So 19th time, we have probably started this from scratch, but hopefully this is a kick in the pants because that capstone check-in is now exactly 1 week away. So if you have not set up your React project yet, now is the time to get going on that this weekend. Create your React project, start moving things over, get your router set up, start going through the steps that we're going through in class. So I'm going to close out of my chat. I'm going to close out and head into a terminal. We'll get some practice CDing around. So I'm going to PWD and see that I'm in my home folder. I'm going to LS and see where what options I have to go into. I want to get into my desktop. So I'm going to CD into my desktop. I'm going to LS again and see I've got all these different things, but I want to get into my C6 my code. I'm going to CD into my C6 my code. Of course, you can always CD space and drag your file path in, but we want to get more practice with the terminal, right? Because no matter what job you work in, chances are as a developer, you're going to be using the terminal. So we want to get practice with that. So C6 my code, I'm going to LS again, and I want to get down into my week 15. So I'm going to CD into my week 15. I'm going to PWD to make sure I made it all the way down there. I can LS and see all my other projects that I'm in. And then finally, I'm going to NPX create React app, and we'll call this day 4 Star Wars. Go ahead and hit the enter button on that. That will install React and all the good stuff that we need. While that is going, I am going to pop open my day 4 Star Wars into my VS Code. Reminder that we do not need to npm install because this is a brand new application. So we only need to npm install when we've deleted our node modules folder. I am then going to npm, I can't npm start until the install is done running. What I can do is share the live share link for you. Now that my node modules is in, I'm going to go over to the terminal, wait to see happy hacking. Once I see happy hacking, I can do my npm run start. That will bring up my spinning React logo. And then I can clean out my files. So my app.css, going to delete out. In my app.js, I'm going to take out the header. We'll also take out the logo.svg because we don't need that. And let's throw Bootstrap in for good measure. So get bootstrap.com, go into the docs, go down to the link tag, go ahead and copy that. Localhost is now turned off, so I'm not hijacking you. To get Bootstrap installed, I'm going to go into public and index.html. Thank you, Austin, for that reminder. And I'm going to paste in my Bootstrap link. And final thing we'll do is in our app.js, we'll make sure a container is working. So we'll throw an h1 in of test and make sure I can see my test. It is in Arial or whatever default font Bootstrap uses. And my container is working because it's not right up on the edge of the page. So reminder for setup, clear out app.css, app.js, delete your header, make sure your container is in here, throw something in so we can see content showing. And finally, in our index.html, go ahead and throw in your link tag. I'm going to throw the link in to Swappy, which is the Star Wars API. And throw that into the chat. Spend a minute or two reading through this, seeing what kind of data we get. And then when we get back from break, we will brainstorm together of what kind of app do we want to build based off of this Star Wars data. Go on break. We will do attendance after break. Remind me if I forget, but we'll do attendance after break. Go on break. Be back at 7:20 p.m. Up the chat application in the first half of class, seeing passing around state, seeing how props work. We are seeing how we map over data. We're seeing the benefits of separating out components. We're seeing reusable components. And we've touched on making an API call a little bit in React, but we'll finish out the second half of class tonight with making an API call and building an application around a data set, right? So the week after the next one, we will have, so next week is the project, the review week, right? So you guys bring in either project ideas, concepts that you're struggling with, things that you're working on your capstone that you need help with, anything and anything, everything and anything is basically on the table for next week. The week after that, we start getting into full stack and setting up our own APIs, right? Then we will do databases, figure out how to interact with SQL, how to save data. Then we get into how we integrate SQL into our full stack APIs. And then that final capstone check-in is actually saving information into the database and having it go all the way through the stack, through React, to the backend, to our own API, to the database, and all the way back through to the front end. However, for the second half of class, we are looking at an existing API, right? And so when we're looking at APIs, I'm a Star Wars fan. I'm a fan of pretty much anything Disney. Yes, I realize that Star Wars came after the majority of it, whatever. Big fan of Star Wars, and there's a ton of information available, right? So we've seen it with Owen Wilson, we've seen it with New York Times, we're seeing it with the weather application, and now we're seeing it with Star Wars. So there's a big data set out there, but this API is not meant to be directly used by humans, right? This is meant to only provide the data, and then we build a user interface around it. So if we look at the Star Wars API, or SWAPI, SW API, we can see if we go into their documentation, there's all kinds of information available over here, right? And so they do have a helper library section where we can actually see this utility that they have built, where we don't actually have to do a fetch and do all of the work around getting the fetch to work. We could just use this right out of the gate. But I do think it is helpful to take a step back and go, all right, let's practice doing the fetch call. Let's get that data showing up in React. Let's build a user interface around it. So I'm going to back up a little bit here. And under resources, they have a breakdown of everything that's available. So if we go into something like Starships, we can see we can either do a request to Starships and get a list out of all the Starships, or we can go to Starships and we see something interesting there. You see that colon in front of the ID? That is saying that this is a route parameter. Where else have we seen a colon in a route? We saw that in the blog project, right? When we said, hey, go to the read page, and this is the specific timestamp that I want to pull up. We also saw that colon and then the name of the information in there. So we've got some interesting information here. If we go look at Starships, we can see a list of all the different starships in the Star Wars universe, right? And this breaks down how much it costs, the size of it, how big the crew is. It will give us the URL to the details of that specific one. And then we can even, and this is kind of interesting, cross-reference some of this information. So where did we see the C-90 Corvette? We saw it in film 1, 3, and 6. So if we get additional information on this, we did not do attendance yet, waiting for the perfect moment. If I click on one of those films, we get a breakdown of all of the details about that film, right? So film ID 1 is A New Hope, happens to be episode 4 because they did movies 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9. And we get a breakdown of all the additional information available about that. So couple different things that we can do here. Let's go back to this is all of the information that we can get data about. So what I'm kind of envisioning, and you guys are welcome to weigh in with ideas here, is what happens if we build a React app that said, hey, go pick a film, right? So let's start with API films. We're going to get a list of all the different films and show them as a dropdown. Then if you pick one of those films, we're going to let you pick any of the characters in those films. And if you pick a character in one of those films, we're going to show you the details about that person. Sound like a good goal to shoot for in React? Or do you guys have another idea that you think would be more interactive or better or more fun or a better learning opportunity? Open to ideas here. Okay, then let's go ahead and dive in to making this work. So the first thing I want to do is when the page first loads, I want to show a list of all of the films. So I'm going to head over into my React and I got to get the data, the call working first. Then I got to figure out where I'm putting that data. Then I have to figure out how to display that data. So I'm going to start with getting the call working. I'm going to head into my app.js, and because it's an API call that will eventually set some data into state, I need to be very careful and not just do that fetch call right in my app. I need to set up a use effect. I'm going to do my use effect. I'm going to not forget that empty array because that empty array is what tells React, hey, don't reload this data every time that we update state. And then I'm going to try and get my data to show up. So I'm going to say const res for my response. And if I do an await here, I'm going to have a problem. So I'm going to do an await fetch to the Swappy API to get the films. So I'm going to say, go do a fetch to Swappy dev API films. And in theory, we should be able to get the data by awaiting the res.json and then console log out the data. However, React is cranky with me because I'm using the keyword await. And if we come up here and think we're being clever and make this async, we now get a different message that says effect callbacks are synchronous to prevent race conditions. Put the async function inside. So React does not like me calling use effect async directly. Instead, what we need to do is put it in its own wrapper function. So we say const make API call is equal to an async function that is going to go do all of this work, and then we make the API call outside of that function. So I save, I come over to my browser, I take a look, I pop open my console, and we get an object back with results, and in those results are all of the movies. I'm gonna pause there, let you guys catch up on the code. And again, the result that you should be seeing in your console in the browser is the an object with the different movies in them.
Why is it again that it renders twice?
It's only in local that it renders twice. Once you deploy it to once you build it through Webpack and bundle it and get it out on the production instance, it won't make the call twice. It's something to do with use strict mode in React and the dev servers being a little funky. I remember doing a deep dive on it like last cohort or two, and the basic answer is like just put up with it doing it twice on local because it's just an expected nature of the dev server. But once you get that out into production code, that is not an issue. Anyone need a minute or need an explanation of any of this code? Or not have it working? Okay, now feels like a good time to go do attendance. Attendance secret word is Star Wars. Yes, Star Wars is the secret word for attendance. All right, once we get attendance done, I now am looking at this data and I'm like, all right, I don't care about the count. I do care about the results. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to figure out what data I really care about, right? So I want to get the results, and this array looks like it's pretty helpful, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by saying, hey, I need to set up my movies, and my set movies is equal to use state. And it starts out as null. Then I am going to say, once I get my data, I want to set my movies to my data dot results. Why my data dot results? The results has all the information in it that I actually want. Now I need to make those results show up. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to do a row and a column, trying to do this on the fly. And I would like a select. And I think I can put form control on it to make Bootstrap make it look nice. Now, what do I want to do? Well, I want to make each one of these movies show up in the dropdown, but I got to fix this first. Use state is not defined, probably the most common error that you will get in React. All you need to do is in your import, if it did not automatically add it for you, go ahead and add your use state up at the top for that import. So I save, I come down here, I get all of my movies, I see that they're in title. That's what I want to show up in this select dropdown. So I'm going to go inside of this and I'm going to say, hey, go to my movies and map over them to get each individual movie. And what do I want to show up for each individual movie? I would like an option that includes the movie title. And because we are mapping over things, I also need to include an ID. But now, because we are finally working with a real database, they are providing an ID to me. That's what I want to use in the key. So I'm going to go back in here and say, hey, I'm going to throw a key that is the movie.episode ID. So I save, I refresh, and I get an error. Cannot read properties of null reading map. What is that error trying to tell us?
Isn't it because you're trying to pull or throw the object into something that wasn't set to take an object?
No. We can set any data type into state. This is an array, and we're setting it into use state as an array, just an array of objects, which state definitely can do. The error that we have is cannot read properties of null reading map. Well, we're using map here, and it's telling us that movies is null. Why is movies null?
Oh, because we need to reload it, right?
We need to show a loading message before we can access the data. Remember, this use effect does not run until the page first renders. So this data is not set yet. The page comes through, it goes, movies is null. I'll run this after the page loads. Now come down here and loop over the movies. And React's like, well, movies is null. I don't know how to map over something that doesn't exist. So what we need to do is come up here and add our if there are not movies, then return a div container text center that says loading. I save, I come over, I refresh, and now I don't have any error messages. And if I click on my select, I get all of my dropdown showing up. And I can come in here and see what other data is available to me. Remember, the important thing here is not that you can code along with me. The important thing here is that you understand why and what concepts I am doing, right? And so if at any point you've got questions on it, now is your time to ask them. I mean, in class in general, at any time is a good time to ask questions. So if you have questions, don't hesitate, throw them in the chat or come off mute and say, can you re-explain that part? Or I understand what the code is doing, but I don't understand what that step is called or why we are doing it. Those are all really important questions at this point. Okay, before we go on, before we make another dropdown, I think it would be kind of cool to have something that says opening crawl. So based off of what movie they selected, we could see this entire breakdown of the entire opening crawl, but only if they want to see it. So we're going to make a collapse expand component based off of what movie they just saw. So because this is something that I can move off, right, and not have in my app, I'm going to make this an entirely different separate component to keep all of that logic together, to keep the state of whether it's open or not. And I may want to reuse this down the road. So I'm going to make a new file in my source called collapse.js. I'm going to say const collapse is going to return a div that has some text in it. I'm going to export my default collapse. Then I need to get this working. So I'm going to go back to my app.js. We'll leave this off to the side so we can work on both of them. I'm going to say, hey, I need to know what movie they selected. So I'm going to come up and I'm going to keep track of that in state. I'm going to say selected movie and set selected movie is equal to use state. And the value of this is going to be the selected movie. And on change, take the event and set the selected movie to the event target value. Now, this selected movie is stuck up in my app.js. I want to tell my collapse what movie is selected so that we can display the appropriate text. So I'm going to go down to below my select and add in my collapse component. Now I should see the text coming out of my collapse from over here. I also am going to send in my movie selected from my selected movie. This is in state. This is the name of the prop. Now, over here, I can add in my movie selected and console log out my movie selected. And I'll pause here and let you guys catch up. So I save, I come over here, I clear everything out, I select the movie, and I see the Phantom Menace that I get access to through my movie selected prop. Can't fit it all on the screen. Don't forget about your use state up here, but this is the bulk of what we're working with.
I got a question just to confirm. So
No
you,
questions. Just kidding. Go
oh,
ahead.
oh, I thought you were serious. You made a new variable for collapse by just putting it inside the self-closing tag, and because you put it in that tag, it will be accessible in the file collapse.
So it's a three-step process. One, we have to make the component by
Yeah.
just capitalizing it and making the function. Okay, 3.5-step process. Step 2 is to export it. Step 2.5 is to import it so it knows what file it's coming from. And then React sees this collapse here and knows if I use this collapse in a tag, it means I mean this collapse up here, which is linked to this file here, which goes to the export here, which goes to the function here, which then takes anything in this return and makes it show up where this collapse actually is.
Okay, thank you. I missed that import part up the top. So I was like, where'd that come from?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm having an issue with mine. It has to do with when I typoed when I made the file initially.
Okay.
And now it's acting like I didn't rename it.
Whenever you rename files in React,
Oh, I gotta
try
close the thing down.
killing your server and restarting it, and that normally is enough for it to wake up and realize what's going on. Still
Yeah,
an
no,
issue?
VS Code's so upset.
VS Code may be still upset, but is your browser upset?
Browser seems fine. Collapse isn't really. Oh, we haven't passed it through yet, so it's. Yeah, browser seems okay otherwise.
Try restarting your entire VS Code then.
What is it with me and like making the IDE upset?
Technically, VS Code isn't an IDE, believe it or not. It's just a text editor. But that's semantics.
Tomato, potato.
Okay. So in our collapse, we are getting access to the selected movie. But what's the goal of the collapse? Two things. One, I want to make it so that if you click on something, it will show all of the text. And if you click on again, it will hide all of the text. But then I also want to make sure that I can see the text in the first place. Well, the problem is we've got the Phantom Menace, and I'm like, okay, that's cool, but I need the text that is from the Phantom Menace. So I also, in addition to sending in the selected movie, I need to send in all of the movie data by sending in the movies. So over here, I can now get access to my movie data. And if I log out both the movie selected and the movie data, I now see Phantom Menace is what I picked, but I get access to all of the movies. Okay, well, I don't need all of the movies. I just want the Phantom Menace in particular. So I'm going to say up at the top here, const selected movie data is equal to go to all of our movies and find the movie where the movie title equals the movie selected. Then console log out just the selected movie data. So I'm going to save that. I come over here. I refresh. It tells me movies is not defined because I called it movie data. I refresh. I pick a movie, and I should see just the details of the movie that I picked, including the opening crawl, which is what I want to work with. We're passing the data in via a prop. We're accessing those props. Then we're doing our filter here, or our find here to say, all right, I only care about the one that is selected. With that selected movie data, I can now go into a P tag, drop my selected movie data dot opening crawl in a P tag, and see the entire opening crawl show up. And if I change to a different movie, I can see that opening crawl. Pausing there for any questions.
Is that the full opening crawl? Why does it seem like a lot less text?
It's not showing the line breaks. And the opening crawl goes incredibly slow.
Guess that's fair.
I wonder, I want to try. I don't think this is going to work, but I'm going to try it anyway. And I replace \n with BR. Don't follow me on this. I think this is going to break everything. Yeah, told you it would. Okay, never mind. We're going to ignore the line breaks not showing up for now. So, oh, interesting problem. I now refresh without picking a movie, and I get another error. Cannot read properties of undefined reading opening crawl. Okay, well, I'm using opening crawl right here. What do you mean it can't read undefined? Well, I'm showing this collapse before I even have a movie selected. So what we've done in the past is say, if there's not a movie selected, return something out. But I'm going to show you a new syntax here. We can say only show this if there is a selected movie. So if there's not a selected movie, don't show the collapse. That's a little shorthand. It's called logic short circuiting, where it basically says we only show this if the selected movie exists. So if we save that and come over and refresh, now I can pick a movie and get the proper text. So again, this is just shorthand to say if there's not a selected movie, don't show this. If there is a selected movie, this is what should show up. We could also accomplish that with a ternary operator. This is kind of a shortcut to even a ternary operator, which feels like a shortcut as is. Okay, we got our collapse in. I'm feeling pretty good about that. Now we got to make it work, right? I want to make it so unless they click on this, we don't see it. So I'm going to say show opening crawl. And I'm going to say, hey, we're going to keep track of opening, let's call it show opening crawl. And by default, I don't want them to see the opening crawl. So I'm going to say use state false. Then I'm going to come down here and say, if we should show the opening crawl, then show this p tag. Otherwise, don't show anything in there. And the last thing I need to do is say, hey, when you click on this H1, set show opening crawl to whatever the opposite of show opening crawl is. Pause there and let you catch up. But if we pick our movie and click on show opening crawl, we see the whole thing. And if I click on it again, it hides it. Want to make some enhancements to that, but just to get it going, I think that gets the accomplishment of what we're going for. Ever turn on a lamp that you never turned on before and realized how dangerous it is to like stick your hand up there and try and figure out if it's like a knob or like the push ones, like inches away from 120 volts? Sorry, just random thoughts I'm having.
You know, I don't usually think about it because I'm like, oh, lamp fine, 2024. And
Yeah, but like, there could not be a bulb in there, and all it would take would be for you to accidentally stick your finger in the socket with it on and having no idea.
do you have just lamps plugged in to the wall without light bulbs in them?
No, but I'm at a friend's house and I just didn't know if like,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
or if you were like in a hotel room or like, a lamp that you've never turned on before. You're like, oh, is this one of those twist ones or one of the push button ones? Sorry, tangent. Yeah, there could be a spider in there. There's so many things that could go wrong. Okay. Pausing there. Everyone good? Oh, don't get me started on smart lights. I am it when I go to bed, I just say, Alexa, all lights off, and every light in the house goes off. And it is the most magical thing to like go to bed with 1,000 lights on and your head hits the pillow and be able to turn off all the lights. It is so worth it to get to that point. Took me a
My
long time though.
my least favorite part of the night is when hub will say like warrant or trouble connecting or something like that. And you're like, great. What do I have you for?
Okay, does anyone not have their opening crawl toggling on and off? And if we change our drop down, we get an updated crawl, right? And hopefully this is showing you, yes, React is complicated. It's yet another thing to learn, but with just a half hour of code, we're able to build something pretty interactive pretty quickly. So let's get a little fancier with it. I'm going to say, hey, if we are showing the opening crawl, we should have the word hide. But if we aren't showing the opening crawl, it should show the word show. In other words, if the opening crawl is open and we want to hide it, we should click hide. Then it changes to the word show. And if we click on show, it changes back to hide. So we can toggle it on and off with just that little command. You can also get a little fancier. Let's throw some styling on this. Let's shrink this down to an H4 because it's probably huge. Maybe we'll add a border of 1 px solid gray. Let's add a little padding on there of 20 pixels, a border radius on of 10 pixels. We pick a movie, let's show opening crawl. We click on that. It shows everything. We click on it again and it hides it. We could even do something where we say, if we are showing the opening crawl, show the down arrow, otherwise show the up arrow. And I'm totally cheating here and using emojis instead of icons, but it gets the job done, except I did them in reverse. This one should be here. So we pick a movie, it says show opening crawl, we click on it, it shows everything, we click on it again, it hides it back up. It's gonna bother me if we don't add a little margin on the top of that of 15 pixels. And the other thing that's bothering me is it's not clear that this is a link, because when I'm hovering over it, I get that cursor icon, right? So we can fix that by just saying, hey, the cursor on this should be the pointer. And now we get exactly what I'm going for.
So why not an on hover?
And on hover, you want it to show the crawl?
Yeah.
Because that's hard to do in React. Actually, no, it's not too bad. I think we can just switch this out for instead of an on click, we should be able to do an on hover. No, it's on mouse in, on mouse. Oh, give me the autocomplete again. On mouse enter. And we go off of it, and you have to re-trigger it, and that's why the hover's a little weird, right? Normally when you have a collapse, you're thinking about clicking on it to expand it and clicking on it again to, you could do something where you said on mouse enter, set show opening crawl to true, and then on mouse leave. Set show opening crawl to false. That's an alternative. I don't really like that. I prefer a click, so I'm going to change mine back to that, but I will leave these in here commented out. If you prefer a hover, you could totally achieve that with that. All right, we are going to do a little bit more work with another drop down here, but hopefully this gives you an idea. The other thing that's really bothering me is this is starting with a new hope preloaded in. Annoying things about selects, unless you give an empty option in the select, it won't show an empty value. So to fix this, inside of our select before our movies.map, we can add an option tag that doesn't have anything in there. And now it will load in empty. And then if we pick a movie, it will give us the opening crawl. And then if we pick a different movie, it will show us the other opening crawl. I wonder what it will do. Yeah, and then if we go up to the top one, it will just clear everything out. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I know that that was a lot of code quickly. But again, we are going for understanding here. So this is a matter of, do I understand what the steps are? Less important that I can actually do the steps because I can always look at the reference code and figure it out. Do I understand what the steps are and why we're doing them in order to achieve the functionality we did achieve? And I'm glad you mentioned the Bootstrap accordion. Yes, Bootstrap does have their own accordion, and there are times that using that or a NPM library for the accordion makes more sense. But this shows you with the power of React how quickly you could make an accordion basically from scratch because of the power of state. You guys, another minute to look this over, see if you have any questions, and then we will move on to the next section.
Yeah, I got a question. So back to the on hover, let's say if the user hover on the show crawl and it put a drop down, right? Is it possible for them to like click on it where like if you move the mouse away from it, it doesn't like collapse? Or
Yeah, you could do this on mouse enter without doing the on mouse leave. So that would say, hey, it starts out as collapsed, but when you put your mouse in it, it now is going to stay open even if you move out of it. Then if you wanted to make the hide work, that gets a little trickier though, because you could do a you could do it like this. Yeah,
Okay.
so you could say on mouse enter, set it open, right? Which is enter opens it. Now, if I go away from it because my on mouse leave isn't enabled, it doesn't do that. But if I click on the hide, that will force it to collapse it. And that's really helpful too when you start looking at the list of all JavaScript events. You can get a JavaScript event that is literally like they scrolled the page or the mouse moved at all the way up to on click or on letterpress or on form submission or right. When we say JavaScript is an event-driven language or the paradigm of JavaScript is event-driven, this is exactly what we mean. Functions don't run, chunks of our code don't run until an event happens in the browser. And that's all event-driven means. I am going to fix this because it says test up at the top and that's bothering me. I'm going to say Max's swappy UI. Okay. Any questions? Anything else lingering? We feeling pretty good about this collapse.
There's
All
a
right.
question about state in the comments.
Oh, thank you. Can you explain movie set movies? Yes. So movie set movies over here. Up here, we aren't allowed to say movies equals this new thing, right? So the order that you want to think about this is movies is what holds the value, right? We can console log movies out and get the results. And that's exactly what we do down here. We say movies.map, we go over them. So movies, the first thing coming out of use state is what holds the value. The second thing that comes out of use state is the function we use to update the value. So we aren't allowed to come in here and say movies equals data.results. We aren't allowed to do that. That is because movies is what we call an immutable variable. In other words, we aren't allowed to change it. So think about movies as being a constant. We aren't allowed to update it. What we are allowed to do, though, is set it equal to a new value. And in order to be able to get the value of the value in state and to be able to update it, we get the use state, but then we say this is what has the data in it, and this is the function we use to update the data that is inside of it. And then finally, the last part here is the null. That is the initial value that movies will hold. So in the chat app, we put 2 objects in an array. So when the page first loaded, there were already some messages in there. We didn't do that here because we were like, well, we don't know what the movies are. We got to go out and get those API results to set them in. So movies is what holds the data. Set movies is the function we use to update that data in state. Good, or follow-up questions? Good.
I
okay.
got a question.
Yes.
Where could I go? I don't know if it's in the documentation for like the actual like source code for these methods.
GitHub. Definitely a tangent, and I don't know that I'm going to be able to find it quick enough. But if you go to React, just do a search for it. I'm shocked that 226. I was looking at the fork number. This is exactly what React is using under the hood. I have no idea if I'm going to be able to find it in this code, but the answer to what you are looking for is somewhere in here.
Gotcha. I feel like it helped me understand a lot of these methods more if I can see exactly what they're trying to do.
You might be surprised how complex it is with the virtual document object model. It may be a rabbit hole too far, but you could definitely give it a try. I think it's going to be one of those things that once you start pulling on the thread, you're going to find that it takes you to the virtual DOM. The virtual DOM is going to take you into just territory that is too complex for me personally, but it is worth a try to give it a shot and see where it takes you. Because yes, there are people who like need to get to the bottom of it in order to understand how to use it, and that's totally fine.
I'll start with quantum mechanics.
The virtual DOM is not far off, so when you get down to qubits, let me know. Okay, so I'm feeling pretty good about this. I think it would be good if we pick one of these to have another column that shows the characters. And if we pick a character, we can show the details of that character. Sound good? So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to, I don't love that this select doesn't have a label. So I'm going to throw a label on here that says select a movie. And I'm going to say this is HTML for our movie select. And then I'll add an ID on here of movie select. And then we'll call this a project done once we get the characters working. So I can pick select a movie that highlights the select for me. I can go and I can pick one. Now I want to have another column for the characters. So I'm going to come in. I have div soup going on. So I got to find the end of this div is right here. So I'm going to do another div class name call. And I'm going to throw a label for character select is going to say select a character, is going to have a select with a, oops, this should be HTML4. And then I'm going to say select ID is character select. And then I'm going to save that. And I'm going to throw a class name of form control on. And then I got to figure out where those characters are. So if I pop open the selected movie, I'm able to see. Ooh, this is going to be harder than I thought. A list of all of these people. But you notice something going on here. All of these people do not have details about them. So we need to go out and get the details from each one of those API calls. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something in a use effect that we haven't seen before. I'm going to do a use effect that is going to make an API call. And we're going to call the make API call. But in this use effect, instead of doing it on page load, which is the empty dependency array, I'm going to say, do this when the selected movie changes. And if there is a selected movie, then I want you to make the API call. So this use effect is saying after the selected movie changes, the effect of the selected movie changing is now going to be making this API call. So think about use effect. We haven't really talked about why is it called effect. Well, the effect of the page loading is to go out and get all of the films. The effect of selected movie changing is going to be making this API call in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, go find the selected movie. Get over here. Go find the selected movie data based off of what movie is selected. Then I'm going to store all of the URLs, the character URLs, by accessing the selected movie data dot characters. And for each one of the character URL, just call it character, of all of the character URLs, I am going to do another fetch. And I would advise not following along with this until we make sure it works, because this is the first time me trying to do this. So I'm going to say const res of fetch, await the fetch to the character, then get the data for that character by parsing the res JSON. And then make an empty array of the character results. And when the data comes back, go to the character results and push in that character's data. And then once we're done with all of that, console log out the character results. And pray. Movie data is not defined. Movie data we call movies in this file. And movie selected is not defined because we call it selected movie in this file. So if I select the movie and wait, I get, holy shit, can't believe that worked. Oh, excuse me. We get all of the characters back that we're looking for. So now you are okay to type this out if you want to, or it's the end of class. If you want to just go along for the ride, you totally can. But let's break down what's happening here. The use effect is saying only run, only do this effect if selected movie data is set. So if there is a selected movie, make the API call. How do we make the API call? Well, first, we have to go find the title of the selected movie and get all of the data that we already had about it in the first API call. We extract out the characters, but when we're looking at all the characters are just a bunch of URLs. So what we do is we say make an empty array to store all of the results. Then loop through each one of the URLs to get each individual character URL. For each individual character URL, do the fetch to that URL, parse out the JSON, then take the resulting data and store it in the character results. Once we loop through all of those character URLs, then take the character results and log them out. So the last thing we're going to do for the evening is we're going to say const characters. Nope, characters, and set characters is going to be a use state. And if there are not characters loaded, we're just not going to show this select. So characters, hide that select if there are not characters. If there are characters, map over the characters to get each individual character. And what we would like to show for each character is an option with the character dot name and a key of, just do character dot URL. Okay, pray for me. Phantom Menace. We wait because it's got to get all the characters in the Phantom Menace. Now it has all the characters. Why don't I have it select? Characters. Oh, I have to set the characters from my character results. Phantom Menace. My data comes back, can open the select, and I get all the characters in the Phantom Menace. Throw an option tag in here so that it starts out as an empty one. Up here. Okay, let me do one more run through of that. We are done with new code, but what we have added here is we said, hey, when selected movie changes, check to see if there is a movie selected. If the movie selected is empty, we don't want to do this. But if there is a movie selected, make the API call. Make API call goes in and it goes, well, the selected movie is just the selected movie title. We need all the other data about that selected movie. So we go through the movies, which has all of our data in it, and we find where the movie title lines up with the selected movie. At that point, we now have access to all of this data. But the problem is the data on the characters are just URLs. So what we do instead is we say, okay, go extract those URLs out and also create an empty array to store all of the results in. Loop over each one of the URLs, go out, fetch that data from the URL, parse the JSON out, and whatever the result of that data is, store it in our character results. Then, once you have done all of those URLs, once you've gotten all of that data back, take the character results and set it into characters. Well, set into characters updates our characters up here. Our characters up here now come down to our characters down here and say, okay, there are now characters, so we should show the select. What should show up in the select will map over them to get each individual character. What piece of information do we want to show in the option? We want to show the character's name. So I save that, I come over here, I pick a different movie. I wait for those characters to load in. And once they are loaded in, I am able to see them all in here. Do one final thing, which is once one of those movies is selected, we should empty the characters out. So we should say set characters to null. That just cleans things up if we're changing movies to a different one. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I know that was a lot. I was going to say believe it or not, but you probably would believe it. This project done completely from scratch, right? I've got no reference code. I've used this API before, but I've never built this interface, right? I've never said, show the movies, show the characters' names. But hopefully this is an organic way to see how we can build this out. A good challenge for you is if this is making sense to you, try and make it so that you can reuse the collapse component to show details about the character once the character is selected. And in fact, we may do that next week, depending on what projects we have going on and how many questions you guys bring in. So final reminder for next week is all about your questions. If I sit here for 3 hours in silence, I will sit here for 3 hours in silence, right? It's all about questions that you guys are bringing in, and we will build projects just like this one around being able to answer that question. And that question may take 5 minutes to answer, or it may take half of the class to answer. That's okay, right? It's all about extracting things out, and hopefully you guys will kind of tag team on each other, right? So we'll do one project, and then you'll see something in there and you'll be like, well, how do I add a collapse to that? Or I need to do this thing in my capstone. Can you give me an example of how to do that in this project? And even though it sounds a little terrifying, that organic nature of things is what makes those review weeks so helpful. So everything is on the table, going all the way back to HTML, all the way up until the Star Wars project as of today, right? So that is what's headed your way for next week. I'm going to stick around for a couple minutes. If you guys have questions about this code, feel free to ask it. I'm going to push it up to GitHub, both what we finished up in the chat app and the Star Wars code right now. So you will have it there to review. If you have any questions, feel free to review and let me know. I'm not available for one-on-ones this weekend. I am available in Slack if you want to get together a list of questions, or of course you can save that list of questions for next week, right? Because next week is all about those questions in the first place. So all of that code is up now on GitHub. I will shut up now, give you guys a minute or two to review, or to say that I have had an entire week of you and enough of you. Please let me go, and I will see you all on Monday.
I put it in the comments, but I did find out where to go. Very overwhelming. I was anticipating it to be a mess, but I said found it, I think. The first 200 lines are imports.
Let me pretend to be shocked that it's overwhelming.
Yeah, this is, I mean, it seems well commented and spaced out and everything, but what am I in right now? React Fiber hooks.js. That's over 5,000 lines of code.
Yes. That is not surprising to me at all.
I'm just gonna get I'm gonna get ChatGPT to be like, explain it to me like I'm 5.
And then all of a sudden you'll be like, why does my computer smell like it's smoking?
Yep. Exactly.
ELI 5, and it's going to say, no, I can't ELI 5 because I'm not 5. And even if I could. All right,
It's
final
cool,
call
though.
for
I didn't know this was
questions.
in there.
All right, I will see you guys on Monday.